Yes. So here's a chance for any questions or comments before I get started with the slideshow. Okay, well, we will look at the slides. I just have a couple of slides, and then we're going to do a video that's kind of a recap of a lot of stuff we covered last week. But the reason I'm doing that is that the stuff we covered last week, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is super important to the history of conservation. So we're going to kind of get stuck in the 60s for a while. So yeah, so today is the spotted owl, the northern spotted owl to almost today. We're going to see that restoration ecology comes into the realm of conservation. And as I said, these issues that we're going to look at today, even though they're national issues, warranting a cover of Time magazine, they are local to Southern Oregon and Northern California. So definitely what was happening here was quite important. So let's do a quick recap. Last week, we saw that after World War II, the Forest Service started to fulfill America's increased demand for wood products. And one reason for that is that a lot of the private ground was cut over during the war to support the war effort. And up until then, the Forest Service had actually sold very little timber. And we see this huge increase in the amount of timber coming off of national forest lands. In 1964, we saw the Wilderness Act, a very significant shift away from developing all lands, where specific lands were set aside to remain undeveloped. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, we had Earth Day, 1970. We see activists like David Brower of the Sierra Club and other organizations, protests over the Vietnam War, and all these things defined environmental activism, and it collided with accepted norms. The status quo was no longer accepted by Americans, and they definitely let the government know that. We have the Nixon era in environmental laws, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, ESA, Endangered Species Act, CWA, the Clean Water Act, and these all set the stage for future conflicts that still resonate today as to what can happen on federal lands. One way of looking at kind of where we've been and where we're headed, we have these different phases of federal lands. If you think back to the first class, we had the United States acquiring public domain after the Revolutionary War. And the United States continued to acquire land up through when Hawaii became a state. But for a lot of those lands that were acquired, the public domain, the policy was disposal, get it into private hands. So post-Revolutionary War up to 1976, there was a policy of disposing of some federal lands. FLPMA is the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and that's the organic act for the BLM. And the BLM was the agency that at one time was getting rid of all these scattered parcels of federal land. But from 1976 onward, the policy was keep and manage those lands, such as the Cascade Siskiyou Monument close by here. Those are BLM lands that have been retained and now are being managed for ecological purposes. Then we had a reservation of the federal lands, and reservation is saying, we're going to keep it. And the first thing was Yellowstone National Park in 1864. And we said we're going to keep these lands, through the 1920s. National forests, national parks, and things like that were being created. It might even go beyond the 1920s. I just kind of picked that date. We have custodial management, and this primarily applies to the Forest Service, and that is, not much was done besides putting out fires, and that's from Yellowstone up to World War II. But what we see after World War II, we see the intensive management begin, and that's where timber is being harvested, more trails are being constructed, campgrounds being constructed, lake-based recreation, reservoirs constructed, and we see boats and houseboats and water skiing on federal lakes, things like that. But for today, we're going to focus on what I'm calling confrontation and consultation. And that's where the American public, through laws, through protests, expressed their desire as how they thought these federal lands should be managed. And then more recently, we see the federal agencies actually consulting with the American people as to how these lands should be managed. So that's kind of the phases. Again, the 60s, 70s, 80s are so important that we're going to watch a recap video to kind of remind us of those things that happened. So I'm going to stop the share of the PowerPoint, and we're going to go right into a video. And then after that, we'll have some time for comments and questions.
The love affair started ending in the 60s, but the divorce didn't occur until the 70s.
We can't hear the volume.
Oh, okay.
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, let me start it over again. Oh,
No, I'm not seeing or hearing anything.
okay. I think I know what happened. I didn't press the right button. Okay, let me find where we are. That's interesting.
We still see PowerPoint.
Okay, well, that is quite interesting.
If you're using dual screens, you might want to change your screen. If that's what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm not doing. Let's see. I cannot find. Oh, I see. I know. Okay, I had to stop the share. Okay, that confused myself there. Okay, I'm going to start the share of the video. So let me find that. Sorry about that. Always trying to find the right button to push. Is it okay now?
The love affair started
Yes.
ending in the 60s.
Yes.
Good.
But the divorce didn't occur until the 70s with the Monongahela and the Bitterroot.
Two national forests, the Monongahela and the Bitterroot, focused national attention on the Forest Service. On the Bitterroot, timber managers were clear-cutting on steep slopes, then terracing the hillside to retain the soil.
They thought if we want to really maximize future growth, let's terrace those lands, like rice paddy fields almost in China.
But geez, the people wouldn't settle for tearing down a mountain to get the trees to grow.
In the early 1970s, Gifford Pinchot, though he had died in 1946, re-entered the political stage once more, and he did so through the voice of his only son, Gifford Bryce Pinchot. In the Bitterroot Valley, Gifford Bryce stood within a clear cut launched by the Forest Service and denounced the Forest Service in his father's name.
He went to the Bitterroot and they took him to a clear cut called the Oh My God clear cut. Because when you come around the corner and you look at it, you go, oh my God. Because it's high on a hill and the road comes right into the middle of it, and it is the most awful looking thing.
I've been back to those terraced landscapes. The fact is they worked, but they just looked terrible. They looked very destructive.
In West Virginia, foresters on the Monongahela plan to regenerate valuable hardwoods by removing lesser quality trees.
People in some of these very critical communities could see these clear cuts out of their kitchen window.
Silviculturally, it made a lot of sense, but it was like poking the public in the eye.
Some local hunting groups were really angered at an extensive set of clear cutting that the Forest Service was doing. These were turkey hunters.
They'd go out to this favorite hunting spot and they'd find it had been completely clear cut And the administrators of the Monongahela at that time said, now don't worry, we know what's best. Just let us do it. In 5 years, we'll show you an improved forest. And that didn't sell.
And so the turkey hunters got together with a couple of wildlife groups and they said, let's go to court and sue the Forest Service based on this old late 19th century law.
They went back to the old 1897 Act, which gave the Forest Service permission to cut trees that were either mature or large growth. And they said the Forest Service didn't have any authority to cut young trees.
The 1897 Organic Act essentially ruled out clear cutting.
And it didn't reflect modern forestry. That was one of the problems. So we said, we're not violating that.
The judge's decision was that the Forest Service was in total violation of the 1897 Act. And the Court of Appeals held it may not be good law, but Congress has to fix it.
And the Forest Service lost big and had to go back to Congress and have its whole Organic Act rewritten to authorize timber.
Beginning with the Wilderness Act, Congress passed a series of laws that shaped national forest management.
There were a whole set of laws passed that really had a powerful influence on the agency. And one of them that I pick out a lot is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act.
NEPA opened the decision-making process to the public and required that projects on public lands be studied by a variety of specialists to determine their environmental impact.
We had to stop just hiring foresters and engineers and really begin to hire people from a breadth of fields.
You've got to have a multidisciplinary approach with wildlife biologists and fisheries biologists and all other kinds of ologists involved.
I was in the camp of the, quote, we call them ologists, the forest biologists and hydrologists they weren't of that same mindset. They came from different schooling, they came from different backgrounds.
Until the late 60s, the Forest Service was characterized by a palpable uniformity in gender, ethnicity, background, education, and profession. They were of one mind, and you couldn't turn to the person at the next desk and say, what do you think of this, and get a really different answer.
As new professionals entered the agency, they began to diversify the workforce in many ways.
And so there was this double whammy of trying to fit into the workforce the new technical specialist and the females and minorities that were coming at the same time. So there were some social adjustments that had to be made.
The focus was on hiring of women and minority persons, and that was at a time when we were just starting to bring on women firefighters.
Probably in the 70s, we started to see the integration of women into the crew. I often wondered what a woman wanted to do to fight fire, to come down grubby, teeth all black, bruised shins, sore muscles, and finally my wife said, well, what do you want to do it for?
You were always being tested. There was always skepticism, but we did the work and they hired us back.
In the fall of 1963, the Forest Service decided that there should be an official woman's uniform. It had a smaller patch than the men's uniforms, and we didn't get a full-size badge. I now have full-size badge, so you can see how far we've come.
I guess I didn't think of it as history when I was selected as the deputy forest supervisor. I looked at it as an opportunity. The Forest Service did recognize that things were changing, but it was difficult. Since then, when I've told people, about my background, and I said it was 1985 and I became the first woman forest supervisor, I've gotten reactions like, did it take the Forest Service that long?
At the same time new voices were coming into the agency, The environmental laws required the Forest Service to open its planning and decision-making process to a broader spectrum of the public.
This group wants to do this, and this group wants to do this, and this group wants to do this, and they all have a right to voice what they think they want to do with these forests. They're the owners coming out seeing how you're managing their land.
The Forest Service is really good about proposing to do new things, provide resources to different constituencies. It's good at saying to the recreationists, sure, we're happy to go build you another campground or a picnic area, and then turn to the timber industry and say, sure, we're happy to provide you a little more timber if your mill's running short, and then turn to the ranchers and say, we're happy to provide you grass for your cows, and then turn to the wildlife groups and say, yes, we're happy to protect habitat for elk so that you can go and hunt them, or turkeys or fish. They like to provide goods and services. People are happy when they provide goods and services. But in the post-World War II period, you can't provide everything that everybody wants all the time without there being some conflicts.
Forest Service planners correlated input from the public with data about natural resources. They hoped that by optimizing the variables, the new computer models would help determine the greatest good.
I think the argument was that you could have everything, you know, the greatest good. You could have social benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits, all on the same acre.
The question of which roadless areas to include in the National Wilderness Preservation System provided an early test of the public involvement process.
The Forest Service, I would have to say, was pretty stingy with wilderness areas in the beginning. We had a rather strict view of what wilderness was. It was pure.
The Forest Service argued that only the crown jewels of American nature should be protected as wilderness, that if we protected lesser areas, it would tarnish the whole wilderness system. But it was also because they didn't want any areas that had exploitable resources in them protected as wilderness.
Once you have wilderness, it's pretty easy. You got a line on a map, and you manage on this side of the line one way and this side of the line another way. Drawing lines on a map solves a lot of conflicts if you can agree on where the line is.
Where there were 62 million acres of roadless areas on the national forest. Conservationists, wanting to be reasonable, proposed only 35 million acres to be studied as wilderness. Essentially, we were willing to let half go. But the Forest Service came out and proposed only 15 million acres as wilderness. And we felt betrayed, and we're very upset, and that's one of the reasons I left Washington, D.C. And that's actually what led to the formation of Earth First.
And I salute you, and I celebrate you, and I love you for being fellow warriors. Earth First!
At the same time that Earth First was using aggressive tactics to stop logging and road building, a natural event leveled an entire forest.
We'll stop it here. I'm not going to cover Mount St. Helens, but in the videos I've posted online, I think the Mount St. Helens piece is there if you want to. That was in 1980. Actually, we just hit the anniversary a couple of days ago. It was May 18th, 1980, when Mount St. Helens blew. What we're seeing is, again, how those events in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are still resonating today. This piece finished up with roadless, and what we'll see in a few minutes here is how the roadless issue actually still is with us today, of these national forest lands that were never reserved as wilderness but never developed for other things as to how to dispose of them, or not dispose, how to manage them. So I want to open it up for any questions or comments at this time.
Cassie here, John.
Yes.
Your opening of today's presentation with a spotted owl on the cover of Time magazine mentions 30,000 jobs were lost or could be lost. Do you have a figure, or does anyone have a figure of the jobs that were lost? If the jobs were lost?
Yeah, I know that jobs were lost. I don't know if the 30,000 number is correct or not. You know, the owl definitely, with the reduced amount of timber coming off the national forest, did contribute to that. But there were some other things. The modernization of sawmills to where they didn't need nearly as many people running a sawmill, the modernization of the out in the woods work where they didn't need as many, you know, loggers and choker setters and people working at the landing. So things were changing overall, but definitely for overall, the spotted owl did make an impact. And yeah, we can just assume the 30,000 number is correct. It definitely hit, you know, it hit rural Oregon, Washington, California pretty hard. Some of the small towns.
Well, in 73, we had the oil embargo, and I remember people, I'd come home to visit, and there were, you know, lines getting into the gas stations here. So that on top of the mills shutting down and the spotted owl, they had a great way of kind of blaming the spotted owl on a lot of these things, but they forget about the 73 oil embargo, and that really put a damper on the economy for the nation as a whole. Well, for the world, actually.
Right. Also, you know, we look at the different generations, you know, like the greatest generation, the baby boom, the millennials, and you can make some assumptions about each generation. And, you know, the baby boomers, you know, we wanted to be in a lot of these small towns, you know, working in the outdoors. And some of the later generations, you know, they're more urban oriented, which also impacted a lot of the rural communities in the West. But what's interesting, the pandemic has actually seen a revival of people wanting to be in small town America. Any other questions or comments?
Just a question. This is Tamsin. You may cover this later, but wasn't there a challenge to the Cascade Siskiyou monument recently?
I don't know that offhand, but I can look that up for next class.
We kept seeing signs around town, you know, save
oh yeah, well, I know that the monument is only in Oregon and does not go into Northern California. And part of that was the congressman for that district did not want it expanded into California. But yeah, let me look at that a little bit further. Sean, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, there was, it seemed like in the video, some comments from what I presume were Forest Service people that made the implication that clear cutting, well, people don't understand that's really good forestry. And that we do that, we can then build a good forest. Did I hear that kind of theme from some of those folks? And how does that change if that's what I was hearing?
Yeah, that is correct. That coming out of the 70s into the 80s, the Forest Service very much embraced clear cutting in the West. And, you know, they had the problem with that 1897 law, and they fixed that with the 1976 National Forest Management Act, which, you know, made clear cutting legal and required some other things like forest plans and more aggressive reforestation. And then what we're going to see later in the slideshow is that aggressive clear cutting, and then the Endangered Species Act, listing the spotted owl, pretty much ended clear cutting on national forests. Bob, you have your hand up.
Well, I wanted to sort of echo what Sean said, because it kind of implied that there's all these different interests, and good forestry would be clear cutting, terracing, whatever it took to increase the board feet. So the criterion of good forestry is industrial production, essentially. And then that has to compete with it looks ugly. It's good forestry, but it looks ugly, or hunters don't like it, or something like that. And boy, I'm hoping that we've gotten well past that. It's terrible forestry. It doesn't create healthy forests. It creates single stand. You saw them in the background, single stand trees so close together that none of them will grow healthy, and there'll be a tremendous fire source, and it's the same mentality. If you shoot the, kill the bad trees, you'll get more good trees. Shoot the wolves, and you'll get more get better elks. And
Yeah,
so I'm hoping we've gotten beyond that. But this film, in the way it sets it up, so far hasn't gotten beyond that.
right, because we're in the 70s and 80s. We're not in contemporary.
Yeah. Okay. No, but the commentators haven't either.
Well, they're old-time foresters, so they're relaying
right.
what their experience is. But again,
Yeah.
you'll see how things evolve. And there is a difference of opinion. Industrial lands in Western Oregon and Washington, they're practicing what you don't like. I mean, they're clear cutting and they're, replanting. So it hasn't completely ended on the landscape, but definitely on federal lands, it has ended. We'll see ecosystem management, some of the other things. Melissa, you have your hand up.
I worked for just summer for the Forest Service back in the late 70s, and there were clear cuts at that time that had been done, I think, under the Nixon administration, and they were done in an area where you were expecting red fir forests, and the only thing you saw at that time were gooseberries just covering the whole thing. And I don't know, I mean, do you happen to know if those forests have ever recovered, if there has anything come back on those, or are those just sitting there like they had sat for 20 years with nothing?
Yeah, the National Forest Management Act, a part of it was what they called the reforestation backlog. And actually, I spent a couple of summers doing those inventories where we went out to those failed plantations, did some inventory work, did soil analyses to figure out, how can we get trees there? But you bring up an interesting point. There was definitely a bias towards some species away from other species. So you mentioned red fir, which is a fairly a subalpine species. And typically in those days when the Forest Service cut the red fir, they would replant Jeffrey pine because they liked pine better than fir. And that's a lot of times why you got the gooseberries, because the Jeffrey pine plantings failed. And if they had done something with the red fir, they might have gotten better regeneration.
I remember, this is Tamsin again. I remember hearing again, this is from the corporate standpoint, that Douglas fir required clear cuts.
It does like open, sunny sites. And so for what the industry is trying to achieve, that's true for them. Fran, you have your hand up.
Yeah, let's see. With regard to Douglas fir, I know that some of the people that are into conservation locally are trying to get rid of Douglas fir so that oaks have a better chance of thriving. I know that.
Yeah, in the lower parts of the Ashland watershed, during wetter periods, a lot of the Douglas fir got established. But today, a lot of those Douglas fir are dying off. And I know a lot of the work being done there is trying to return it more to hardwoods, oaks, and ponderosa pine. So it's not that Douglas fir is a bad species. It's kind of off-site in parts of the watershed.
Right. So about the monument, I believe that was set up during the Obama administration, and that the Trump administration rescinded it, along with a number of other monuments.
Yeah, they didn't rescind it, but they studied it for being to shrink it or eliminate it. And what we'll see next week is the Bear's Ears, what was shrunken drastically by Trump. And there was another one, I can't remember it offhand, maybe Escalante in Utah was also shrunken. I know that the current administration is looking at restoring the original boundaries of those monuments.
So I had one more comment,
Sure.
Which has to do with if people are interested in ecology, keeping the ecology strong in the area. I heard an interesting talk by a grad student at SOU. He had studied invasive plants, and he found that they were near roads, within a mile of roads, and along the Pacific Crest Trail, especially near trailheads, and near Hyatt Lake, where they had done a restoration project. Apparently the forestry restoration project had brought in a huge number of weedy species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, roads are definitely a typical avenue of the spreading of invasive plants. And you mentioned, a crew bringing in weeds with them. I know for a lot of firefighting today, before out of area crews can go to the fire, all their equipment, their trucks, fire engines have to go through a car wash to remove any, mud that might contain seeds, things like that, because you might have a crew coming out of Montana where there's spotted knapweed, and you don't want them bringing that down to Oregon. So I'm going to stop the comments and questions and get back to the slideshow. And then in about 10, 15 minutes, we'll take our 5-minute break. So I'm going to mute all and then go back to share screen. Okay, and then, okay. So we're going to finally start talking about the spotted owl, the northern spotted owl. There's also a California spotted owl in the Sierra Nevada mountains and a Mexican spotted owl in Arizona and New Mexico. So it's called, at that time, it was called the winged snail darter. And if you remember the history of the Endangered Species Act, the snail darter, a fish in the East Coast, was the first challenge to development that we saw under the Endangered Species Act. It ranges from Northern California to British Columbia. Eric Forsman, a biologist at Oregon State, was kind of the first one to sound the alarm that this old growth dependent species was in steep decline due to timber harvesting. And, the Forest Service did try to manage for some owls, but they were fairly small areas and not large reserves for the northern spotted owl. So let's look at the early 90s for the West Coast, especially Oregon, Washington, Northern California. The timber industry was king of the Northwest, with much of the timber being cut old growth. 1990, the northern spotted owl is listed under the Endangered Species Act. Soon after that, the Seattle Audubon and other environmental groups sue the Forest Service, BLM, that, about their timber harvesting practices not being consistent with this listing of the spotted owl. So in 1991, Judge Dwyer in Seattle essentially puts a halt to timber sales in owl habitat on federal lands. So we're looking at getting into 1992, logging's at a standstill, tensions are mounting. You have things like this, joke thing here of spotted owl helper. So you can see the sides dividing of, owls versus jobs type dichotomy. So in 92, we have a change in administration. And what's interesting is when Clinton and Gore were running for the presidency, they came out to the West and they talked about this controversy over the northern spotted owl and the impact to rural communities that were timber based. And so Clinton had promised to tackle the spotted owl issue during the campaign. His opponent, first George Bush, was pretty silent on the spotted owl. And so after being elected, Clinton held a forest summit in Portland in 1993. And a scientist, Jack Ward Thomas, with the Forest Service, he was assigned to head up a team. And they came up with 9 alternative approaches to northern spotted owl conservation. with option 9 being the compromise that allowed some logging, but also set aside some significant areas for the owl. So what came out of that option 9 was it was evaluated through the NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act process. An environmental impact statement was created and circulated. And the results of that NEPA document was a plan that covered 24 million acres up and down the West Coast. And it was national forest, BLM, and national park lands. And the focus was on spotted owls and old growth dependent species. So they went beyond just the owl. They said, let's look at these ecosystems and the species that need old growth or late successional habitat to survive. So they set up a network of reserves, old growth reserves, and then matrix lands where limited timber harvesting was allowed. And they also established what was called adaptive management areas, where things would be tested. What if we tried to favor certain species over other species? How would the owl respond? Things like that. This Northwest Forest Plan promised a sustainable harvest level of 1 billion board feet per year from the Northwest. It included an aquatic conservation strategy that became a pretty important piece of the overall Northwest Forest Plan. And it also included what was called a survey and management requirement. And we'll go into those here in a minute. Regarding the owl itself, we have these late successional reserves, and the reserves were in some ways kind of like a big circle where you'd have the core habitat, the roosting and nesting habitat for the owl, and then outside that initial circle, you would then have foraging habitat. One thing interesting about the northern spotted owl is that they're very territorial, and so biologists could go out and call, kind of, imitate the sound of an owl. And the owl would be like, who's in my territory? And so they would typically fly to where they heard that sound to see, who's trying to invade my area. And then the biologists could also do what's called mousing, and they could, put a mouse on a log or on a stump. And the owl would then, if they had a nest with young in it, they would swoop down and pick up that owl, or pick up the mouse to take it back to the nest. So you can see here this, white mouse is something that had been offered to these owls. And so they knew that it was, they had a nest. And so that was usually an important thing to know about the northern spotted owls. And so that created an activity center. And so the Forest Service and other agencies would then monitor these activity centers. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they would then declare these late successional reserves as critical habitat, which is a term under the Endangered Species Act. So let's stop it there for any questions or comments. And then we'll do one more video. So I'll stop the share. So now we're getting into the owls. Any questions or comments at this point? Roger. Oh, you're muted. You can press your space bar or just unmute yourself. Still muted.
If you press your space bar, you have to keep it down.
Yeah, press and hold. Oh, there you go. Now you're unmuted, Roger.
Can I let it go now?
No, keep holding it down.
Okay. Whatever happened to the barred owl controversy?
It's still out there. Barred owl, we'll see later today that barred owls were not native to the Northwest, and they have moved into spotted owl territory, and pushed spotted owls out of these areas. There's even some people that think that the barred owls are breeding with spotted owls, creating what they would call a sparred owl that would weaken the genetics of the spotted owl. So barred owls are not a good thing, and biologists are pretty perplexed as to what to do about it. But again, there's a video I'll try to show later that gets a little bit into the barred owl.
Thank you.
And anybody else? Jim? Okay. Okay, well, let's watch Bob.
Just one of the reasons why forestry practice doesn't like old growth forest or old trees. If you look at a tree that's cut and you look at the rings, you'll see the big fat rings when it's young and thin rings when it's old. So what that means is that an old growth forest is not adding board feet of lumber at a rate that a young one is. That would be equivalent essentially to harvesting human beings when they're 18 or 20, when they're, their maximum meat that they're putting on is done. So, but then but by looking at that way, there's no valuing of the old growth itself and the way the old growth supports the growth of stuff under it.
Yeah, the science of forestry, a lot of it's based on getting trees to grow fairly fast. And an old growth tree, yeah, they're not growing nearly as fast as, let's say, a 60 to 80-year-old tree.
So they're a waste.
Well, I live in a wood house, so I appreciate wood to a certain extent, but it doesn't have to be old growth.
You don't have to do the old growth.
It could be OSB or something like that. So let me show one more video. Oh, actually, let's take a break right now. Let's take a 5-minute break. And my watch says that it's 11:44, so come back at 11:49. We'll start with a video and then get into ecosystem management.
No, this is just the break. All about spotted owl conference. Well, it wasn't so cold. I said it's every time you take your walk. It's so cold.
Hey, John, your microphone's on. We're hearing your conversation.
Actually, sorry, this one. I like this. I don't need to offer it again. I can take it again.
Hey, John, your microphone's on. Oh, good. That's good.
About 2 more minutes of break and then we'll get started. As you can see, this next video starts off with Ronald Reagan in 1980s. And this is a 7-minute video that'll end up talking about the listing of the northern spotted owl. So it'll repeat some of what I've covered, but I think it's good to see it from a different perspective. And then after we watch this video clip, we can take some more questions and comments. So here we go.
Environmental and social changes of the 60s and 70s brought a conservative shift, including the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
The president was elected to bring about change. I was appointed to bring about change.
We had a new administration, and they felt that we should have a lot more timber harvest than the Forest Service had proposed in the plan.
The Forest Service probably could cut about 25 billion board feet a year off the commercial forest lands within the national forest in perpetuity.
But when you got out on the ground and you started seeing things like, oh, wow, well, there's a rare and endangered species living in this drainage, and over here there's only 2 inches of soil, and it's on the type of rock formation that if we cut 6 trees, it's going to fall into the creek.
DeBonis formed a group within the Forest Service that sided with environmental organizations in challenging the agency's timber program.
And the first loyalty of these new professionals was not to the agency, but to their profession.
It had made for an interesting culture that a lot of people referred to as the combat biologist era, whereas as you were really there trying to have a say in a large organization, in the system, and the way it did business, and yet you really weren't welcome at the table, and the advice you were giving isn't the kind of advice that they really wanted to hear.
It was about a 10-year battle during the 1980s between environmentalists and the timber industry, between people within the Forest Service itself who wanted to get the cut out, and other ones who were saying, we shouldn't be doing, we can't do this, and we shouldn't be doing this.
We were beginning to feel the pressure from industry and communities to do what it was we were doing beyond maybe what we should be doing.
But we're going to be a little short. We're going to be short maybe 3 or 4 million board feet.
You know, we're only talking about 250 acres additional per year.
I'm very happy to try. And if we can, within these constraints, do it. But I'd rather leave it open-ended.
And I will be very honest with you, the agency got caught up in that scenario, and we went to the dark side. We began to be driven by our budget, and we began to be driven by the political pressures.
The drive to get out the cut it's a funny thing. I don't think, I mean, a lot of people would say, oh, it's because they're getting paid off. Well, I can guarantee you no one got paid off in the Forest Service. There was an attitude, an ethic that was very pro-logging.
We peaked out when I was chief, and I think one year, I don't remember which one it was, 1987, 1988, somewhere there, we harvested over 12 billion board feet. And that was the high year for the Forest Service.
We were a culture that believed that engineering and science could get us around it. If they didn't like clear cuts, we could use beauty strips, leaf strips along the highway. If a mountainside couldn't regenerate timber, we could fertilize. We terraced. We did all these mechanical things, all in the spirit of the utilitarian philosophy of man over nature.
And by the mid-'80s, it was apparent that no, you needed to start from a different philosophical base.
We stretched the multiple-use concept as far as we could to wrap our arms around these things, but it just wasn't big enough, and so that's when we had to go to a bigger concept of ecosystems management.
The scientific basis for a new approach to management came in part from Forest Service research on the west side of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon and Washington. The national forest there contained large trees that had been spared during logging's westward expansion. Environmentalists called these stands ancient forests. Timber managers called them overmature and decadent. To the public, they were known mostly as old growth.
Policy towards old growth in the Forest Service when I got started in the late 50s as a full-time professional was liquidation.
And they were, in a sense, decadent, that there were trees that were falling down and rotting and falling apart, and which we now look at as ecosystem attributes, at the time was viewed as huge waste.
In these old forests, that what we've been describing as decadence was in fact, in many senses, niches, places where different organisms could live.
One organism inhabiting the old growth was the northern spotted owl.
The Forest Service, it was dawning on them that at the rate that we were cutting against the old growth supply and at the rate we were fragmenting habitat, that we were going to have a collision with the Endangered Species Act. And it was probably going to be spotted owls, and if it wasn't that, it was going to be something else.
The timber sale program was enjoined by Judge Dwyer as a result of concerns over how the spotted owl was being accommodated on the national forest.
And of course, that just terminated the timber sale programs on the west side forests.
I could show you a graph that shows you a high level of sales till 1991, and then Judge Dwyer issued his court decision. It plummets down to near zero.
The sudden drop in timber supply devastated the rural economy in the Northwest.
In some communities, the Forest Service employees were looked upon as the enemy because we were part of the reason and part of the government that led to the reduced timber volumes.
The reality was that the owl really didn't create most of the problem that the timber industry was having.
In the end, we need to learn this was not about spotted owls, it's not about marble murrelets, it's about ecosystems.
As science revealed the complexity of ecosystems, ideas about forest management began to change. Understanding fire's role in the forest was an important lesson.
We're going to stop it there, not get into fire until next week. Okay, let's see. So let's see if there's any comments or questions before we get back to the slides and get more into ecosystem management. Okay, don't see.
John, after all this controversy about the spotted owl, what is the status of the spotted owl today?
It's still declining. The barred owl is part of the problem. Wildfires are part of the problem. And the fact that in a lot of places we have a mixture of industrial lands with federal lands, and the federal lands can't carry the total habitat requirement for the owl. So the outlook is not good. Okay, I'm going to get back to the slideshow And we will see at the end again. I have one more video about the spotted owl that we'll see at the very end. Okay. So we're talking about the Northwest Forest Plan. And, again, the reason for the plan was the northern spotted owl. And that was kind of the catalyst. But the planners said, let's take a broader approach. Let's talk about other old growth dependent species. And also they said, well, let's talk about the watersheds, the water quality, the aquatic element. And so because of the decline of salmon and steelhead populations, the Northwest Plan includes what's called the aquatic conservation strategy that overlays on the conservation of the northern spotted owl. So the aquatic conservation strategy has a number of elements to it, with watershed health being the prime objective. And the requirements, riparian reserves, which is a streamside buffer, that's a riparian reserve. A key watershed, where you look at a total watershed and say, is how important is this to the overall health of a larger watershed? If it's key, let's put more emphasis there to maintain the quality of the water. And like, let's say the Ashland Creek watershed providing drinking water for the city of Ashland. I'm almost sure that that's considered a key watershed. And then the third requirement of the aquatic conservation strategy is a watershed analysis. And again, it's, before we take any action, restoration action, let's at least do some studies and see, what's going right, what's going wrong in this watershed. And the Clean Water Act, again, one of those Nixon era laws, overlays with the aquatic conservation strategy, where we would look at, is there an impact due to temperature, nutrients, sediment that needs to be addressed in a watershed. Roads were mentioned earlier today about, being ways that weeds get into our ecosystems. Well, one thing we looked at with the aquatic conservation strategy is that roads are actually one of the main ways that sediment gets into our waterways, especially when roads are poorly managed, where you might have a ditch running right into a live creek. And when you have a heavy rainstorm, that sediment in that ditch just goes right into the creek. Another thing that we saw was that a lot of these roads, when they put in a culvert, fish weren't able to pass from one side of the road to the other. And so we had to work on removing those barriers to fish passage. And where there were diversions, let's say for agricultural purposes, we didn't want the fish to get, sucked up into the ditch, going out to a farmer's field. And so we would put fish screens on water diversions. And then another thing we looked at was the role that large woody debris plays in the stream. And this is a really interesting thing, because in the 50s and 60s, it was seen that wood was a detriment to streams. And actually a lot of money was spent pulling logs and wood out of our stream courses based on some bad science. And what we saw back in the 80s and 90s is that, no, we need wood in streams, because wood creates habitat for the young fish. It helps keep the creeks fairly cool, things like that. And then finally, some of the streams and rivers had been channelized. So it might be a straight channel with riprap along it. And what we've learned is that water wants to meander. Water doesn't normally take a straight course. And we see that in our rivers and streams, natural meanders. And by putting the meanders back into the stream courses, you can actually improve water quality, water temperature, things like that. Speaking about roads, one thing that started in the 90s, and we first saw it at Redwood National Park, is the decommissioning of roads. And basically, it's returning a road back to its natural state, getting rid of that road prism, pulling the soil back into what had been a road, and then revegetating it. And you might ask, well, why Redwood National Park? Well, in the late 70s, Redwood National Park had a major expansion into a lot of industrial timberlands that had roads and plantations and things like that. And so the Park Service had to say, hey, how do we get this to be more park-like in terms of our ecosystem management? And getting rid of unneeded roads was one of them. And so the techniques for road decommissioning was pretty much pioneered by the Park Service, and then the Forest Service learned from that. As I said a few minutes ago, another requirement of the Northwest Forest Plan was what we called survey and manage. And this was a last-minute addition to the plan, where a lot of the scientists working on the plan said, hey, we have all these species that we don't know very much about. So let's put a requirement in that prior to any type of ground disturbing activity, let's require a survey looking for these species. And it was kind of an unintended consequence was that at one time, the survey and manage was one of the most stringent requirements of the Northwest Forest Plan until revised. And it was revised as we found out more and more information about these species. And an example might be a salamander that lives in a talus slope in an area where it had really never been studied. And so under the Northwest Plan, we did start studying these species, and we found out what their habitat needs were and how management might impact them. And then, citizen collaboration did change in the 1990s to where instead of, the Forest Service just saying, here's what we're going to do, send us a letter if you're interested, but don't really talk to us. And collaboration is an attempt to upfront work through these contentious issues with the citizen participation. And typically, you want to do that before a project is solidified as to what you want to do. So you might share with that citizen group, well, here's the issues, here's what we think we want to have happen out here, but what do you think? Let's go out and look at it on the ground. And I know in the Ashland watershed, there's been a lot of collaboration done as to how it should be managed. Collaboration could be an interest-based approach as opposed to position-based. So looking for those common things, what do we share in common that we want to achieve out here? And it might be, water quality, it might be species diversity, things like that. And there's even some collaboration done that did not include the Forest Service. There was a group in California called the Quincy Library Group, if you know where Quincy, California is, surrounded by the Plumas National Forest. And that was a group that included industry, the Sierra Club, and some others. And they did not invite the Forest Service even to their meetings. And actually, after they decided what they wanted, they went to Senator Feinstein and Congressman Herger, and the bill was passed directing that part of the National Forest System as to what kind of activities they wanted to see. The goal is to get early buy-in and avoid appeals or litigation. A drawback for collaboration is it can be a long and drawn-out process. Years and years of meetings and field trips, and it's if you have a regular job, it might be hard to keep participating with a federal agency on that type of collaborative process. And sometimes another drawback is that key players, key groups, key not agencies, but key people that have information about an area may refuse to participate and just say, I don't have time, or I don't think it's going to come up with something that I'll agree with. So ecosystem management, I want to just briefly talk about it. That it was and is a new approach for land management for the Forest Service BLM. And one thing it looks at is what's the historic range of variability in an ecosystem. So how did this ecosystem evolve over time, and using that information decide how it should be managed in the current time period. And so typically for a given ecosystem, we describe a desired condition. What do we want it to be? And then we compare that desired condition to the current condition, and then propose projects to move it from where it is to where we want it to be. And I have a very simple example that I'm going to use, and my example is going to take place in the high alpine lakes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And what you have in the Sierra Nevada mountains is the yellow-legged frog is a native species that you find in meadows and lakes. And over here you have what's called an eastern brook trout, not native to the high Sierras, but was planted by Fish and Game and other people that wanted to fish for trout. Well, the problem is that the eastern brook trout loves to eat the tadpoles of the yellow-legged frog. And so our desired condition is alpine lakes with yellow-legged frogs, but our existing condition is we have all these eastern brook trout eating the frogs. So the project may be, we're going to remove the eastern brook trout, maybe through netting, maybe through some kind of, chemical, but we want to get it back to a healthy frog population. So that's an example of an ecosystem management approach of a desired condition, an existing condition, and a project to achieve that. Another thing that came out of ecosystem management is what we call stewardship contracting. And what we saw was the old timber sales that were just, focused on, cutting trees, that it was insufficient for ecosystem management, that we wanted to facilitate a broad range of activities to improve the land, to achieve that desired condition. And so stewardship contracting would focus on the end result rather than what is removed. And so a stewardship contract might bundle a whole bunch of agreements and contracts together. So you might have a bundle of contracts where you have weed removal and thinning and piling and burning of slash, things like that, all put into one project. And finally, you can have what's called a goods for services aspect of a stewardship contract, where maybe the value of the trees harvested helps pay for the weed removal. Or you simply just add money, the agency adds money to the contract to pay for the weed removal. Moving along a timeline here, we're in the late 90s. We see the reintroduction of gray wolves in the western United States. They were native across all of the West, but they were extirpated from Yellowstone in the 1920s. And I know most of the West, there were no wolves, listed as endangered in 1974. So in 1995, Canadian wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. As you can guess, ranchers outside the park were not very happy with wolf reintroduction. And now we see wolves, throughout Oregon, Idaho, and recently I know there's at least 2 collared wolves that they've tracked into Northern California. Although we talked recently about the Endangered Species Act, we have federal responsibility for animals as opposed to state responsibility for animals. And if an animal is delisted, such as like in Idaho, the state then has responsibility. And you might have seen headlines where the state of Idaho says they want to eliminate a large portion of their wolf population. Year 2000, we have what's called the Secure Rural Schools Act. A little bit of background on that. We have an old 1908 law that provides 25% of Forest Service and 50% of BLM receipts to counties for roads and schools. And with that sharp decline in timber output, these counties started starving for those funds. They're really hurting. And so this 2000 Act allows the counties to choose an average of the 3 highest payment years and then get federal funding to kind of backfill what they're not getting from those timber receipts. This act also set up what's called a resource advisory councils that help decide, how a portion of the fund should be spent. I'm part of a nonprofit group in the Mount Shasta area that builds trails, and we actually got some of these Resource Advisory Council funds for building trails. And this 2000 Act has been renewed several times. It expired in 2015, and it was funded by Biden's 2021 COVID relief bill, with $193 million being distributed to the states just a couple months ago. So even though it seems to kind of live and die, it's still alive right now. So let's take a break here and see if there's any questions or comments. We've gone through the 80s and 90s, gone through OWL into ecosystem management. Now we're seeing some laws come into play since ecosystem management.
What happened with that Idaho and is it Idaho and the wolves? Were they allowed to do that?
It's a proposal at this time. A lot of the wildlife conservation groups, environmental groups, are pretty upset with Idaho for proposing that. Yeah, time will tell as to whether they're able to carry it out or not. I know some of the legislation has actually provided funds for ranchers to pay for livestock that's killed by wolves, as a way to make it more palatable.
So is there any discussion still, like the old days when I was a younger hippie, the idea is that we were expanding onto their land rather than we need to protect the ranchers, we need to protect, because we don't need to be in those certain places. Or is it still looking more at industry and ranchers as having a right to be there?
I guess it depends what your point of view is. The ranching, livestock grazing on federal lands is done under a permit. So it's, and some of these permits, date back 100 years or so when they were originally granted. Sometimes a rancher just says, I'm done and doesn't want the permit anymore. We saw that in Hell's Canyon when it became a national recreation area. A lot of the ranchers just said, no, I'm not going to graze cattle here anymore. Next week, we're going to talk about the Bundys who refused to pay for their grazing permit in Nevada, and the brouhaha that caused. And then the son of Bundy being active in the taking over of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge a number of years back. So it's still a hot issue. Okay, so we'll continue with the slideshow, and then we have one more video at the very end on spotted owls. So we'll do the share. So we're now in the early 2000s. And there was my slide for questions. This was an iconic photo of a 2000 wildfire with the deer in the creek and the background burning up, and quite a photo that we saw on a lot of calendars and books and stuff. So 2001, we have the roadless area rule, and this is as Bill Clinton is leaving office. We had these roadless areas that were inventoried by Rare 2. And as I said before, a lot of them just didn't have final disposition. So in the final days of the Clinton administration, 59 million acres were administratively protected from additional roads. It's not wilderness, it's just protected roadless. And there's been many lawsuits in 2001, and one as recent as September of 2017. There was a recent proposal to exempt the Tongass National Forest in Alaska from the roadless rule. But up till today, the rule seems to hold firm that these lands will remain unroaded. We talked about the Northwest Forest Plan, and it was the concept of a large-scale plan dictating how land should be managed. And that was for the west side of the Cascades. And so for the east side, in the early 2000s, there was an attempt to do what was called the Interior Columbia Basin Ecosystem Management Project, or what some people called Ice Bump. And it was for the drier forests of the east side going into Montana and Idaho. And it crashed under its own weight. And so it was never really completed, although completion was a decision to use the science that was developed during the process. And, I think the Northwest Forest Plan may be the first and last large-scale ecosystem management plan. 2002, we see Oregon having its largest wildfire, the Biscuit Fire, 500,000 acres. Somewhat controversial in terms of the salvage logging of the trees killed by the fire. And portions of the Biscuit Fire reburned in 2017 with the Chetco Bar Fire. So these fires in 2000, 2002, during the George W. Bush administration, we see the Healthy Forest Restoration Act as a response to these catastrophic wildfires. And essentially, this act facilitates fuel reduction projects on national forest and BLM lands. It requires that upfront public collaboration, and we see the use of collaboration more and more. We see community wildfire protection plans, which I'm pretty sure Ashland Watershed is under one of those. And then we see the emergence of a new term in our lexicon, a WUI, a wildland-urban interface. So here the concept is, instead of treating fuels out in the boonies, let's treat forest fuels close to communities and protect those communities. And so the Forest Service, BLM, Park Service tried to identify the communities at risk. And definitely Ashland is one of them. So you see a lot of fuels work done adjacent to town here. You see evacuation routes, things like that, acknowledging the risk of catastrophic wildfire. We have the Obama administration come after the Bush administration, and in 2009, they have their own legislation addressing ecosystem health, land management. This was an omnibus bill, so it has a lot of things. So it added wilderness, it added conservation lands, but more importantly, it has this collaborative forest restoration fund. So it sets aside money to do work in the federal lands to promote restoration activities. Oh, and here's I had mentioned that they had wolf livestock funds set aside to reimburse ranchers if their cow or sheep gets killed by a wolf. But let's look a little bit further at this collaborative forest landscape plan that Obama put forth. It facilitates reduction of wildfire management costs, demonstrates restoration techniques, encourages utilization of any byproducts to offset treatment costs, and it had earmarked money to be spent. And we see in the Rogue River Basin some of these monies being spent here for fuels reduction restoration work. And so locally, they set up this Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative, a lot of groups, nonprofit groups, agencies, even in the Southern Oregon Small Diameter Collaborative was part of that group. And then that group went on to do an assessment of wildfire risk, looking at 5 landscape scale management objectives, with the main thing was to promote community protection. And they had mechanical treatment themes of thinning, cutting brush, masticating the fuels, all for the attempt to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. And in our own backyard, we have the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, where we see a lot of thinning, controlled burning, education, landowner grants, because there's a little bit of private land actually up in the watershed. Lomacatsi is a nonprofit that does a lot of the work. And then the monitoring is done by the Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy. So I have just a 1-minute video here that I'm going to show. It's a YouTube video. There it is. So expand this, and here we go.
Forests provide the clean air, water, wildlife, and recreation that make Southern Oregon a special place to live and visit. Ashland Forest Resiliency, or AFR, is celebrating 10 years of successful ecological thinning and controlled burning to protect our drinking water and community. Collaborative forest restoration projects like AFR are now coming together across Southern Oregon for healthy habitats and safer communities. This important work also supports jobs and local economies. Knowledge of fire from Indigenous people and science both show that our forests need frequent mild fire to thrive. Professionally trained teams bring back mild fire with controlled burns applied during favorable weather. Controlled burns revitalize nature and help protect our neighborhoods. So when you see or smell smoke from controlled burns, know that together we're carrying the torch for resilient forests and safer communities.
Okay, what's being done in the Ashland watershed is really pretty amazing. It's probably one of the best places in the whole United States for the government, nonprofits coming together with funding to try to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So, maybe it's good news, bad news. The good news is this is as good as it gets. Maybe the bad news is this is as good as it gets, because we probably could still have catastrophic wildfire. So I'm going to do the rest of the slides and then one more video. So we just talked about the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project. So we're going to get to a recap and one more thing about the owls. So yeah, the situation today is the spotted owl is still in decline, due to wildfires, barred owls, and pesticides. Under the aquatic conservation strategy and more focus on salmon and steelhead, we see dams being removed. Timber harvest levels are low. Harvest for wood products has shifted to harvest for fuels reduction. So I think that's a pretty important thing. We're not just cutting trees on national forest and BLM lands, for houses. We're cutting trees to try to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So here's a graph here showing the historic amount of timber sold on national forest lands, very, very low before World War II, and then after World War II, it really shot up. The listing of the spotted owl, it crashed, and it's a lower level coming into contemporary times. But this lower level is much more wildfire reduction, timber harvesting than just cutting trees for lumber. Wood processing in Oregon, there's almost no more old growth mills left, at least in Southern Oregon. Rough and Ready Mill in Cave Junction was one of the last, and it shut down in 2013. And so because of this, a lot of the sawmills have had to retool for small diameter logs using computer technology to, to get a 2x4 out of a pretty skinny log. And we see the innovation in wood products, glulam beams, oriented strand board or OSB, cross-laminated timber. And then we also see the biomass being burned for electricity. It's not a panacea for generating electricity, but it is a component of a renewable portfolio for electricity. I'm going to skip over that and just give you a clue as to next week. We're going to look at politics and wildfire. We're going to see what Trump did and tried to do. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of next week talking about wildfire. But I do want to share with you this one last video on owls. My apologies if it slops over 12:30. You're free to leave at that time if you need to. But this is, I think, a pretty interesting video.
Eric Forsman and Damon Lesmeister are hiking deep into the Siuslaw National Forest to check on a nest site. They are two generations of wildlife biologists who have been leading the research of a bird that has been slowly vanishing from Oregon's old-growth forest for the last 50 years. The most controversial bird in U.S. environmental history, the northern spotted owl.
So she's right up there. You see her? They just appear oftentimes just out of nowhere. And then it's just, wow, they're here.
When they look at you, the eyes are just, they look almost coal black. They're actually kind of a real dark brown when you get close, but they look at any distance beyond a few feet, they look black.
And it takes you about 1 minute to really, have a lot of passion for these birds.
The northern spotted owl once lived quietly and anonymously in northwest forests like this one. In the 1970s, Eric Forsman pioneered their study and learned that the spotted owl survived deep in the old-growth forests, the same forest being logged to fuel the region's timber economy. In the 1980s, it became clear that the last patches of old-growth forests on public lands were shrinking. Timber interests pushed to keep cutting, but a growing environmental movement rallied to block them. The spotted owl became the controversial symbol at the center of a political and economic conflict.
To list the owl would be poor science, and it certainly would mean economic disaster. We feel it would mean betrayal by our own government.
Is timber not put here for man's use? You are a hypocrite, buddy.
No, there's going to be so many people that are outraged. This is all out war.
Somebody could be martyred in this whole event.
People refer to it as the Spotted Owl Wars, and it was in some ways a war. It was, very strong feelings on all sides, and something that was not easily solved.
They're going to shut the mills like this in Oregon and Washington down.
In 1990, the spotted owl was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. It appeared in Life magazine and even the cover of Time. And the issue became so embroiled that the president, vice president, and cabinet came to Oregon for an unprecedented timber summit. In 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan significantly limited logging of old growth in national forests. With the protection of the old-growth habitat that the spotted owls needed to survive, biologists like Eric hoped to see the owl's population stabilize and even recover, but it didn't turn out that way. Arriving to Oregon from the East Coast came a new threat. Another owl, called the barred owl, invaded the spotted owl's home range. Biologists aren't sure why they showed up, but the impact of their presence became clear. Barred owls are larger and more aggressive than spotted owls. They claim their nest sites, compete for food, harass, and will even kill spotted owls.
When we first started doing spotted owl research 50 years ago now, there were no barred owls in these forests, and now they're virtually everywhere. The crews spend a lot more time doing night calls because they can't find the birds anymore, they're gone. So it's just become much more difficult to do work on spotted owls.
This is the 5th season that Elena Thomas has called for spotted owls. Because owls are active at night, and because they're territorial, biologists have learned that if they hoot, the owls will hoot back.
So this is the caller that we use for surveys. I wasn't here when the owls were all over at every site, so I don't know the experience of that, but I definitely had a lot more pairs in some of my sites than I do now. So I've seen kind of a decline. It's pretty discouraging. I mean, it gets harder and harder to do all of these sites. I mean, you kind of know that the populations are decreasing a lot, so it's kind of daunting to go out and day after day and not hear anything.
Techniques that serve the first generation of spotted owl researchers, like night calling, are harder and harder to use as the populations decline.
We have our hexagon ID.
So Damon, the next generation of spotted owl scientist, has had to find other methods. He's exploring a new field called bioacoustics. Damon and his graduate student Layla bring digital audio recorders into the forest.
This SD card is 497.
We're just recording constantly for 4-hour blocks at dawn and dusk.
And this is location 5. At any given station, we've got about 350 hours of recordings. So it would be very unlikely in those 350 hours for something that lives here that makes noise to not make a noise.
The recorders collect so many hours of sound that it would take an individual 100 years to listen to all of them in real time. So the recordings come here, the supercomputer at Oregon State University, where the data can be crunched at lightning speed. The computer analyzes the sounds and suggests what might be a spotted owl. But Zach Ruff has to confirm which ones are actually spotted owls.
How many spotted owl confirmations do you have at this site?
Like a dozen.
They are not just simply labeling spotted owl calls, but actually using the very latest artificial intelligence technology. They train what they call the neural network to process the millions of forest noises and interpret which are actually the calls of spotted owls. Somewhat ironically, the computer mistakes the sound of logging for spotted owls.
Yeah, you see, it's very mechanical sounding, but that's a yarder from logging equipment. And this is a perfect example of something that obviously is not a spotted owl. The next time it encounters this, it won't get it wrong the next time.
Damon's work is creating new baseline data. Years from now, other biologists could scan the recordings to identify other species and get a better understanding of the old-growth forest biodiversity over time.
And so really we've come to an age where you think of it as sort of next generation natural history.
Although the potential for bioacoustic research is encouraging, the hard reality is that the spotted owls continue to decline on a slow but steady course towards extinction. By bringing the sounds of the forest into his lab, Damon has a front row seat to observe the change.
It's entirely possible that our last documented spotted owls may come through recordings. For a forest to be fully functioning well as an ecosystem, spotted owls are a critical component of that. You know, they're part of the forest, and the forest is less without them.
Okay, so that's that video. And sorry for going over, but if people want to stay on and ask any questions, make any comments. So what you saw from that video is that the spotted owl is headed for extinction. And they're using artificial intelligence to still locate the few owls that are out there.
Thank you, John.
So did anybody have any comments or questions?
Thanks. Another awesome class. I really enjoy it. Appreciate it.
Very good. Thanks, John.
Okay,
Thank you.
next week, fire and Trump and Biden.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.